June of 1942. Sevastopol. The city was burning beneath a grey sky that pulsed with the glow of distant explosions. Smoke rolled down from the hills like fog, carrying the heavy taste of gunpowder and the scent of the Black Sea. In the tunnels below, where the air was thick and the walls trembled with every shell, a young signalwoman leaned over a dying radio set. Her name was Yevdokiya Zavaliy. She was 20 years old and had not slept for 3 nights. The only light came from a flickering lamp above her head, casting her shadow against the concrete like a ghost that refused to leave. The earphones pressed to her head hissed with static. No words, no orders, just the endless breath of a city being drowned by war. Before we go further, take a second to imagine this moment. The lights shaking above you, the smell of burning metal, the feeling that every breath could be your last. Could you keep working the radio, steady your voice, and believe someone out there was still listening? Tell us in the comments what you would have done. And if stories like this help you remember the people history almost forgot, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more voices waiting to be heard. The static deepened. Somewhere above, artillery screamed. "Try the alternate frequency," shouted the lieutenant beside her. He was bleeding from his temple but refused to leave his post. Yevdokiya adjusted the dials, her fingers slipping across metal slick with dust. A faint pulse answered, a whisper of code hidden in the noise. She leaned closer. "Message incoming," she said quietly. Then the ground lifted. A shell hit the ridge above them. The lamp exploded. The world turned white. When the dust settled, she could no longer hear from her left ear. The lieutenant lay motionless beside her. The receiver was shattered. Her notebook, filled with half-decoded coordinates, was smeared with blood. She whispered into the broken microphone, "Battery 54, correction, range 2,400. But the line was dead. Only silence answered. Outside, the sky burned red. The once proud fortress of Sevastopol was dissolving in fire, its harbor glowing like molten steel. Yevdokiya stepped toward the bunker door. The walls shook, dust falling like snow. She glanced one last time at the broken radio, the machine that had carried so many voices, and then she removed her headset. The rifle beside her fallen officer was still warm. She picked it up, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped out into the smoke. That night, in the heart of a dying city, the signalwoman who once carried the voices of others became something else entirely. She became a fighter. The night air struck her face like sandpaper. Outside the bunker, the world had no horizon, only fire and dust. The harbor was a smoking wound, the water below slick with oil and blood, glowing faintly where burning ships reflected across the waves. Each explosion from the German artillery painted the sky for a heartbeat, then left everything black again. Yevdokiya moved through the trenches with the others, but no one asked her name. The soldiers she followed were silhouettes, shapes of men too tired to speak. They carried ammunition boxes, wounded comrades, and rumors that the city had already been abandoned by the rest of the fleet. One looked at her and muttered, "Another replacement from the reserve line." She nodded without answering. The noise made words meaningless. At dawn, the fog rolled in from the sea, white, low, and smelling of salt and smoke. In that pale light, Sevastopol revealed what the night had hidden. Streets that once led to cafes and theaters were now trenches lined with sandbags. Cranes from the shipyard jutted like the bones of dead giants. The cathedral dome, once bright with copper, had a shell hole through its heart. A marine captain stopped her near an old trolley line. He looked at her uniform torn, covered in soot, and frowned. "Where's your unit?" he demanded. She hesitated. "The communications post," she said. "Destroyed." "I'm the only one left." He studied her face for a moment, then handed her an ammunition belt. "Then you're with us now," he said. "3rd Company. We need every rifle we can get." She followed them to the shoreline battery, once a warehouse, now a fortress of sandbags and steel plates. The Marines there called it the City of Iron and Salt. Iron from the factories, salt from the sea, and the taste of both on every tongue. Yevdokiya watched as they prepared their guns. There was rhythm in their movements, loading, checking, signaling with their hands. It reminded her of radio work, precise, mechanical, a language made of motion instead of sound. She found a place beside a crate of mortar shells and began to reload cartridges, copying the man next to her. Above them, the Luftwaffe returned. The sound of the dive bombers tore through the morning air, a scream that made the ground tremble. She flattened herself against the wall as the first bomb fell into the harbor. The shockwave rolled through the warehouse like thunder underwater. When she lifted her head again, a sergeant was shouting for volunteers to carry ammunition to the upper gun. Before she could think, she was already moving. The crates were heavy, her arms shaking, her lungs raw from smoke. By the time she reached the deck, her hair and uniform were the same color gray with dust and salt. A nearby Marine saw her and grinned. "You're quiet for a new man," he said. She didn't correct him. If they saw her as one of them, maybe she could survive. That evening, the city's electricity failed completely. The only light came from the fires and the phosphorescent trails of tracers streaking across the sky. Yevdokiya sat with her back against the wall, watching sparks fall like snow. For the first time since leaving the bunker, she felt a strange calm. She had no radio, no orders, no signal to send, only the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, matching the distant artillery. Somewhere beyond the ruined harbor, the German guns fell silent for the night. The Marines lowered their rifles, exhausted. In the darkness, one of them began to hum a song, something about the sea, about home. Yevdokiya listened, her fingers tracing the cold metal of her weapon. The sea answered softly, whispering against the shore. Morning broke without color. A low mist crept inland from the harbor, muffling sound and turning the ruins into pale ghosts. Yevdokiya woke to the smell of gun oil and seaweed. Her hands were blistered from carrying ammunition, and her throat felt coated with ash. Someone passed her a tin cup of bitter coffee. She drank it without tasting it. Orders came down the line before sunrise. German infantry had breached the northern dockyard and were pushing toward the old warehouses. The Marines were to counterattack and hold the line until reinforcements arrived from the upper batteries. There were no reinforcements. Everyone knew it. She followed the others through the shattered streets, stepping over broken glass and shell casings. The captain walked ahead, his coat torn, his voice steady as he pointed toward a row of burned-out trams that would serve as cover. When the first shells fell, they dropped flat against the pavement. The sound came late, like thunder chasing lightning. Yevdokiya's heart hammered so loudly she thought the others could hear it. Her rifle felt foreign in her hands, an object built for someone else's life. Around her, men shouted to each other, but the words were lost in the roar of artillery. She remembered the rhythm of the radio: dot, dash, pause. Now the same rhythm pulsed inside her chest. "Ready," the sergeant said quietly. They waited for the smoke to thin. Through the haze, she saw movement shapes in grey advancing along the tram line. Someone shouted, "Fire!" Her finger pulled the trigger before her mind understood what she'd done. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The sound was sharp, immediate, final. She fired again. When the smoke cleared, a German soldier lay motionless a few meters ahead, his helmet rolling against the curb. Yevdokiya stared at him, unable to breathe. The others were already reloading, shouting for more ammunition, but she stood frozen. Her stomach clenched, and she turned aside, retching into the rubble. The taste of iron filled her mouth, the same metallic tang as the sea. A hand touched her shoulder. The sergeant's voice was calm. "Keep your head down. You did what you had to do." She nodded without speaking. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the rifle. But when the next wave came, she raised it again. Each shot felt easier, though the noise seemed farther away, as if the world were receding behind a wall of smoke and sound. By midday, the counterattack had stalled. Half her company was gone. They pulled back to the dockyard and set up new positions behind the cranes. The sea was covered in drifting debris, wood, oil drums and bodies. The gulls circled low, their cries merging with the whistle of falling shells. Yevdokiya sat beside a shattered truck, reloading her weapon with trembling hands. She realized her ears were ringing again, the same deep hum she'd heard in the bunker when the radio died, except now it was inside her. She wiped her face with her sleeve. The sergeant crouched beside her, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. He looked at her rifle, then at her face. "You're not bad for your first day," he said. She tried to smile, but her lips wouldn't move. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of her rifle and the figure falling. She whispered into the darkness, as if into a radio microphone that no longer worked. "Battery 54, she said softly. Signal received. The words disappeared into the wind. Night returned like a tide. The city had stopped shaking, but the silence was heavier than the explosions. Yevdokiya sat beside a broken window in what used to be an office. The typewriters lay overturned, their keys scattered like teeth across the floor. A candle burned on a tin lid, its flame bending with each draft. Outside, the sound of distant guns was faint, like thunder beyond the horizon. She had found a scrap of paper inside a desk drawer and a half-burned pencil. For the first time in weeks, she began to write. The letter was addressed to her mother, though she knew it would never leave the city. She wrote slowly, her handwriting uneven on the rough surface. "Mother," she began, "I am safe, or as safe as one can be here. I still hear the sea every night. It sounds different now, angrier, as if it knows what's happening to us. The men here are brave but tired. We have all become parts of the same machine, turning until something breaks." She paused, the pencil hovering over the page. There were things she wanted to say but couldn't, about the faces she remembered from the radio room, about the man who had died beside her, about the first enemy she had shot. She drew a line instead, a long dash that looked like a signal pause in Morse code, a habit she hadn't noticed she still had. "I think often about our old house," she continued, "the one near the river, where you could hear the bells from the dockyard on Sundays. I used to believe those sounds were the heartbeat of the city. Now all I hear are engines and guns. Sometimes I wonder if they are the same thing." Footsteps echoed down the hall. She quickly folded the paper and tucked it inside her coat pocket. It didn't matter that she had no envelope, no stamp, no way to send it. Writing it was enough to remind her that another world still existed somewhere beyond the smoke. The Marine who entered was carrying a bucket of water and a loaf of hard bread. "Rest while you can," he said, setting it down. "They'll hit us again at dawn." She nodded, her fingers brushing against the folded letter. He didn't ask what she was writing. In this city, no one asked questions. Everyone carried ghosts, and most were better left alone. When he left, she leaned back against the wall, watching the candle melt. Wax pooled around its base, the flame flickering lower. She took out her letter again and reread the first line. For a moment, she imagined her mother's voice, soft and distant, answering through the static. Then she blew out the candle. The room plunged into darkness. Somewhere in the city, a flare rose into the sky, painting the clouds red. For a few seconds, the walls around her glowed like firelit glass. Then the light faded, and Sevastopol sank back into the night. The order came before dawn. It was not shouted this time, just passed quietly from man to man, "Prepare for counterattack at first light." The words spread like a spark through the exhausted line. Yevdokiya felt her pulse quicken as she checked her rifle, her fingers stiff from the cold. The fog was thick, rolling over the ruins like smoke from an invisible fire. The air reeked of oil and salt. Every breath tasted of metal. The Marines moved silently, shapes among the broken walls. No drums, no signals, only the soft click of weapons and the rustle of boots on gravel. The captain knelt beside Yevdokiya and traced lines in the dirt with a piece of shell casing. "2 platoons will flank through the warehouse," he said. "We'll move straight ahead and draw their fire. When you see the green flare, signal the artillery." She nodded, though her stomach felt hollow. They waited in the half-light until the first bird cried over the harbor. Then the fog split with the crack of rifles. The Germans answered instantly, machine gun bursts tearing through the morning stillness. Brick and dust erupted from the walls around them. Yevdokiya ran forward with the others, crouched low, her boots slipping on the slick stones. Bullets sparked off the steel beams. Someone fell beside her, then another. She didn't stop. At the edge of the dockyard, she dropped behind a pile of sandbags and looked toward the captain. He raised the green flare pistol and fired. The light burst overhead, a slow, drifting flower of green flame sinking through the mist. Her training came back like muscle memory. She found the broken field radio she had carried since the bunker, a useless relic she had refused to throw away. Inside it, she had repaired one wire using scraps of copper stolen from a generator. Now, she pressed the transmitter key, knowing it would never carry her voice. Instead, she used the signal lamp beside her, flashing the pattern manually toward the harbor batteries. Short, short, long, pause, long. A reply flashed faintly from the cliffs above the sea. Then came the sound, the deep-throated roar of naval guns opening fire. Shells screamed overhead, trailing smoke as they struck the enemy positions. The earth shook, windows shattered. It felt like the city itself had found its voice again. Yevdokiya watched the Germans scatter under the barrage, their advance collapsing into confusion. She kept sending corrections, counting the intervals by instinct, her fingers bleeding from the friction of the signal key. The Marines cheered, pushing forward through the smoke. When the shooting finally stopped, the air was filled with dust and silence once more. Bodies lay twisted among the ruins, indistinguishable from the debris. The captain walked past her, his face grey with exhaustion. "You did well," he said quietly. "You called it perfectly." She didn't answer. Her ears were ringing again, a dull, endless hum. She looked down at the shattered lamp, its lens cracked, and thought of the old radio she had left behind. Once she had sent voices across invisible air. Now she sent light through smoke. As the fog began to lift, She saw the sea beyond the harbor, flat, grey, and calm for the first time in weeks. The sun rose weakly behind it, a pale coin above the horizon. Yevdokiya lowered her head and whispered to no one in particular. Signal received. The smoke from the morning battle still drifted through the ruins, curling in the broken windows like ghostly curtains. Yevdokiya sat on a crate outside the dockyard warehouse, her hands black with soot. The sun was rising higher now, pale and cold. Around her, the survivors moved quietly, patching wounds, stacking ammunition, collecting the dead. No one spoke above a whisper. She had not eaten since the previous night. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder where shrapnel had grazed her skin. She tried to wash the blood away with seawater, but it left a salty sting that wouldn't fade. When she finally lowered her hands, she saw the captain approaching. He was a tall man, gaunt from exhaustion, his face streaked with grime. He stopped in front of her and studied her closely, his eyes narrowing. "You're not from the 3rd Company," he said. She froze, unsure how to answer. "Where did you train?" he asked again. Her mind searched for words, but none came. The captain's gaze moved to her collar, then to her hair, dark strands that had come loose from her cap, glinting faintly in the sunlight. It was enough. He understood. For a moment, he said nothing. The air between them felt heavy, filled with the distant echo of hammering and waves. Finally, he sighed. "You should have told me. I thought you'd send me away," she said quietly. He nodded once. "I should. There are regulations. No women in frontline units." He looked around at the men resting nearby, faces hollow, uniforms in tatters. "We're down to 40% strength," he muttered. "And you just directed an artillery strike that saved what's left of this sector." She said nothing. He took a slow breath. "You'll stay, but from now on, you answer directly to me. Understood?" She hesitated. "Understood, comrade captain." He turned to leave, then paused. "What was your rank before?" "Private, in the communications corps." "Then you're a Marine now," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Get some rest, Marine Zavaliy." The title hit her harder than she expected. Not mockery, not tolerance, just recognition. For the first time since the siege began, she felt seen. Later that afternoon, she sat alone on the seawall, watching the tide pull debris from the harbor boards, helmets, a floating fuel drum spinning lazily with the current. The horizon shimmered with heat and smoke. Somewhere beyond that line, the enemy was regrouping, and the battle would begin again soon. She touched the bandage around her arm, still damp from salt water. Her heartbeat matched the slow rhythm of the waves. The captain's words echoed in her mind. Marine Zavaliy. It didn't matter that she had not chosen the title. The city had chosen it for her. When the next shell fell in the distance, she didn't flinch. She looked toward the sound and whispered, "Signal received." That night, the wind shifted from the sea, carrying with it the low hum of engines. The Marines had grown used to that sound, the warning that bombers were coming again. But this time, the noise came from every direction, blending with the waves until no one could tell where the danger lay. Yevdokiya was repairing a field lantern when the first siren wailed. She stood up, the flame flickering out, and instinctively grabbed her rifle. The captain's voice echoed down the trench, "Take cover, move!" She followed the others into a dugout carved into the hillside. The bombardment began without rhythm, as if the sky itself had broken apart. Bombs fell across the harbor, then the city, then the cliffs. The earth shuddered beneath them. The air turned to dust. Inside the dugout, people prayed, shouted, or simply stared. Yevdokiya pressed her palms over her ears, but the sound was everywhere, an ocean of thunder that swallowed thought. A direct hit struck nearby. The shockwave slammed through the tunnel like wind through a bellows. Yevdokiya was thrown against the wall, her head striking the timber. For a moment she felt nothing but weight and light. Then came the ringing high, sharp, endless. She touched her ears. Warm blood. Someone was screaming, but she could only see their mouth moving. When the blast stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. She opened her eyes to find the dugout half collapsed. The lantern shattered, the air thick with smoke. Through the haze, she saw a young soldier pinned under a beam, his lips forming words she couldn't hear. She crawled to him, her hands bleeding, and tried to lift the wood. It didn't move. She motioned for another Marine to help, but he shook his head. He couldn't see her in the darkness. So she lit a flare. The sudden red glow filled the tunnel, painting everything in blood-colored light. The others turned, saw her, and rushed forward. Together they pulled the man free. He gasped for air, coughing, alive. Yevdokiya could feel the vibration of his breath, but still heard nothing. When they finally reached the surface, the city was burning again. The night sky pulsed with tracer fire, and the glow of oil fires along the docks. The air was hot and heavy with ash. She stumbled toward the seawall, dizzy, her head throbbing. Behind her, the Marines shouted orders, but their words were just shapes in the air. For a moment, she thought she had gone mad. The world had become a film with the sound cut out, mouths moving, explosions flashing, waves crashing, all without a single noise. Then she realized she could still feel the vibrations, the rumble of artillery through her feet, the rhythm of her heartbeat in her chest. She could still read the world, just differently. Dawn found her sitting on a piece of broken wall, staring at the horizon. The fires had died down, leaving trails of black smoke drifting into the pale sky. Her hair and uniform were grey with dust, her eyes bloodshot from smoke. When the captain approached, she didn't hear him until he stood in front of her. He mouthed something she caught only one word: rest. She nodded slowly. She looked out toward the sea and tried to remember the sound of waves. It came to her not as noise but as rhythm, as pulse, as memory. And in that silence, she discovered something new, an awareness sharper than sound. The war had taken her hearing, but it hadn't taken her ability to listen. Days blurred together. The city had stopped being a place. It was now a labyrinth of ruins and smoke. Every corner smelled of rust, ash, and the sweet rot of seawater soaking into brick. The Germans had cut off the last supply routes. Food came in handfuls: dry bread, a spoon of porridge, a sip of brackish water. Yevdokiya no longer tried to count the days. She moved through the remains of the harbor with practiced calm, carrying ammunition, hauling stretchers, or digging shallow trenches for the wounded. The pain in her ears had dulled into a constant hum, a reminder that she was alive. She read orders by watching lips, by gestures, by rhythm. War had its own silent language now, and she spoke it fluently. The Marines had started calling her the quiet one. Some thought she couldn't hear because of fear. Others knew the truth. Either way, they followed her when things grew chaotic, because she never panicked. She seemed to sense danger before it arrived, the faint tremor in the ground, the vibration of distant artillery, the shift of air before a bomb. Her body had become its own kind of radio. One afternoon, she was assigned to the field hospital inside a half-collapsed school. The hallways were lined with cots and sheets soaked through with blood. Nurses moved between them like ghosts in white coats, their faces grey with exhaustion. Yevdokiya carried water and helped bandage the wounded, her movements steady and wordless. A medic handed her a note scribbled in pencil. "If the tanks break through, take the wounded to the basement. We'll hold as long as we can." She nodded, folding it into her pocket. Later, when a shell landed nearby, shaking dust from the ceiling, a young soldier grabbed her arm, shouting something she couldn't hear. She steadied him, pressed her hand over his heart until his breathing slowed, then pointed toward the exit. He followed. That night, as they sat in the dim glow of a lantern, a nurse whispered something to another woman. Yevdokiya couldn't hear the words, but she caught the smile, the glance in her direction. Then the nurse wrote on a scrap of gauze and handed it to her. The words were simple: "You're like a signal that never stops." She read it twice, tracing the letters with her finger. For a moment, she remembered the days before the siege, the steady pulse of a transmitter, the crackle of static, the calm certainty that someone was listening. Now, in this silence, she had become that signal. Outside, snow began to fall, melting as it touched the warm stones. It mixed with the smoke and ash, turning the air grey and soft. The city was dying slowly. But inside the ruined school, there was still movement, still breath. Before sleeping, she took out the letter to her mother. The edges were smudged, the paper damp from seawater and time. She added one new line at the bottom: "The city still lives." Then she folded it again, placed it close to her heart, and closed her eyes. By midwinter, Sevastopol no longer looked like a city. The harbor was a graveyard of twisted ships and frozen cranes, the streets a network of trenches and shattered walls. What had once been the voice of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet had gone quiet. The last working radio towers had been destroyed. But then, one morning, new voices rose from the ruins, voices that did not belong to them. A small loudspeaker crackled to life on the enemy lines. The sound drifted across the water, slow and measured, echoing through the broken port. It was a man speaking perfect Russian. His tone was almost gentle. "Comrades of Sevastopol," the voice said, "your resistance is admirable but pointless. Moscow has forgotten you. Your commanders have fled. Lay down your arms. The Germans treat prisoners well." The words floated through the ruins like smoke. The Marines listened in silence, faces hard, some pretending not to hear. The broadcast repeated every hour, sometimes switching to a woman's voice, sometimes to a choir singing old Russian songs, sweet and wrong in their beauty. Yevdokiya stood near the wall of a collapsed warehouse, watching lips move as others cursed or spat at the air. She couldn't hear the enemy's words, but she could see them feel the rhythm of their propaganda in the faces of those who still had ears. She recognized the danger. Sound was a weapon. Silence was armor. That night, she found an old field radio buried under debris. Its wires were burned, its tubes cracked, but some parts were intact. With help from a mechanic, she scavenged copper from a wrecked generator and rewired the set. When it finally hummed faintly, the others gathered around. "What can we do with it?" one asked. She wrote a word on a scrap of paper, noise. They didn't understand at first. Then she demonstrated connecting the radio to a signal lamp and generator, sending bursts of random static toward the direction of the enemy. Not words, not music, just a wall of soundless light, interference across the frequency. The Germans responded with louder broadcasts. The Marines answered with laughter and gunfire. But Yevdokiya just kept flashing her coded bursts into the night dots and dashes that meant nothing, or maybe meant defiance. When dawn came, the loudspeakers were silent. The propaganda had stopped, at least for the moment. The captain found her sitting beside the radio, her hands black with oil, her face calm. He handed her a cup of cold coffee and asked, "What did you send?" She wrote the answer on the back of a ration label and passed it to him. He read it, smiled faintly, and folded it into his pocket. The note said only, "We're still here." That day, the Marines began painting those same words on walls, on helmets, on shells. It became their unspoken motto: no anthem, no speeches, just 4 words scratched into metal and stone. Even without sound, the message carried farther than any broadcast. When night fell, Yevdokiya sat watching the stars through the smoke. She could not hear the world anymore, but she could feel its pulse steady, stubborn, alive. In the silence, she smiled. By early July of 1942, the city had become a skeleton. The once crowded streets were trenches now, filled with smoke and echoes. The Black Sea glimmered under a sky of ash, its waves washing quietly against the bones of burned ships. Sevastopol was dying, but it refused to die quietly. The last message from command came on a torn strip of paper delivered by a runner. "Hold until the final shell." No signature, no location, just those words. Everyone understood what they meant. Yevdokiya's unit was down to a few dozen men. They held a battery overlooking the harbor, a maze of concrete, sandbags, and broken machinery. The captain moved slowly among them, his face gray with exhaustion but his voice calm. He carried no illusions. "This is it," he said. "They'll come from the east at dawn." Dawn came with the rumble of engines. German tanks crawled through the smoke like beasts made of iron, their tracks grinding over the ruins. Behind them came infantry, methodical and unhurried. The Marines opened fire. The sound was swallowed by the roar of artillery. Yevdokiya crouched beside the signal crate, loading shells into a mortar. Her world was vibration and motion, the thump of the weapon, the recoil through the ground, the rhythm of her heartbeat. Each explosion felt like a wave breaking against her chest. She couldn't hear the captain's commands, but she didn't need to. The signals were in the gestures, the lift of a hand, the nod of a head, the flash of light on a helmet. A tank shell struck the upper wall, scattering concrete like rain. The impact threw her backward. She tasted blood and grit. When she opened her eyes, half the trench was gone. The air was filled with dust and falling debris. She crawled toward the signal bunker, the one she had repaired days before. Inside were boxes of flares and ammunition, the last supply they had left. The captain was there, bleeding from his shoulder. He pointed toward the ammunition pile and mouthed one word she could read easily: destroy. She hesitated. He placed his hand on her arm, steady, firm, and nodded. They both knew what it meant. If the enemy captured this position, they would use it to fire on the remaining batteries. She tore a strip of fabric from her sleeve and wrapped it around a flare. Her hands didn't tremble. For the first time since the war began, she felt perfectly calm. Outside, the tanks were almost at the wall. She looked once at the captain. He smiled faintly. Then she struck the flare against the wall. The spark caught. She turned away. The explosion lit the sky brighter than daylight. A column of fire rose over the harbor, rolling outward in a wave that turned the air white. The ground heaved like the deck of a ship. From the cliffs miles away, sailors later said they saw the flare bloom over the city, one last signal rising into the smoke. When Yevdokiya opened her eyes again, she was lying among the ruins. Everything around her was burning. The fortress had fallen. The sounds were gone, replaced by the dull throb of silence. She could feel her heartbeat, but nothing else. She crawled from the wreckage and looked out over the harbor. The ships were gone, the guns silent, the flag torn. Above the smoke, the morning sun shone pale and cold, as if nothing had happened. She whispered the words she had written so many times before. "We're still here." But her voice made no sound. When Yevdokiya woke, the air was still heavy with smoke. The ground beneath her was warm from the fires that had burned all night. Ash fell like snow, covering her uniform, her hair, her hands. The ruins around her were silent, except for the faint creak of twisted metal cooling in the morning air. She tried to stand, but the world tilted. Her legs trembled, her ears rang with nothing. She pressed her palm to the ground to steady herself, feeling the slow pulse of her heartbeat through the stone. The fortress was gone. Sevastopol had fallen. German soldiers moved through the rubble, grey shapes against the haze. They searched bodies, took watches, cut insignia from uniforms. She stayed still, pretending to be one of the dead, until a shadow fell across her. A voice barked something harsh, clipped. A boot nudged her shoulder. She opened her eyes. The soldier frowned when he saw she was alive. He shouted to another man, who waved for her to get up. Her body obeyed, moving automatically. They led her down the ruined street toward the docks, where prisoners were being gathered, hundreds of them, some wounded, some barely standing. The sun was bright now, cruel in its clarity. It revealed everything: broken helmets, torn flags, the dull glint of empty shell casings. The air smelled of rust and salt. They searched her for weapons. When they found none, they pushed her toward a line of prisoners. A German officer paced before them, gloved hands clasped behind his back. He studied each face with detached curiosity, like a man inspecting machinery. When his gaze reached her, he paused. Her uniform was scorched, the insignia unrecognizable. Her hair, short and matted with soot, hid her features. He asked a question she couldn't hear. When she didn't respond, he repeated it, louder. She shook her head slowly. Another officer translated into Russian, name, unit, rank. She hesitated, then answered in a hoarse whisper, "Private, Communications Corps." The translator looked puzzled. "Where is your radio?" She lifted her empty hands. The German smirked. "No radio, no signal," he said in German, and turned away. They marched the prisoners toward a camp outside the city. The path wound through fields of burned grass and abandoned trenches. Yevdokiya kept her eyes on the ground, one step after another, the weight of exhaustion heavier than her rifle had ever been. At the camp, the prisoners were divided. Officers to one side, enlisted to another. She stayed silent, keeping her head down. If they discovered she was a woman, her chances of survival would vanish. Days passed in grey monotony, work details, counting rations, moving stones, digging ditches. She watched lips move but heard nothing. At night, she wrote in the dirt with a stick short notes, coordinates, fragments of memory, and erased them before dawn. It kept her mind alive. One evening, a German guard noticed her drawing and snatched the stick away. He kicked the dirt, smearing her marks, and shouted something. She stared back, unflinching. He raised his hand as if to strike, then stopped. Maybe he saw something in her eyes that made him hesitate. He dropped the stick and walked away. That night, under the dim light of a camp lantern, she used a scrap of tin to carve 3 letters into the wooden wall of her barracks. SOS. It was the only signal she still knew how to send. The next morning, she awoke to find it gone. Someone had sanded it off. But she smiled anyway. Even erased, it had existed. Someone had seen it. The raid began at twilight. For hours, the camp had been unusually quiet, the guards uneasy, the air thick with the smell of rain and kerosene. Then, without warning, the sky began to flicker. At first, it was just a reflection on the clouds, a distant glow. Moments later, the ground trembled, the low, rhythmic vibration of distant explosions rolling toward them. Yevdokiya felt it before she saw it. Her body recognized the pattern. Long pause, then 3 quick shocks. Artillery, but not German. Someone else was firing. The guards shouted, their movements sharp and frantic. She couldn't hear their words, but their fear was unmistakable. Searchlights swept across the camp, slicing through the dust. Then came the planes. Flashes ripped the sky open, brilliant, white, and soundless in her world. The explosions landed like invisible fists, shaking the ground beneath her feet. She stumbled out of the barracks as walls collapsed behind her, timber and flame mingling with smoke. The prisoners ran in every direction, some calling names, others falling without sound. She moved through the chaos like a shadow, keeping low, following the rhythm of the blasts. Each tremor in the earth was a guidepost. Each gust of heat showed her where not to go. She crawled beneath a fence torn by shrapnel, cutting her hands on the wire. Blood streaked her fingers, bright even in the half-light. Beyond the camp was a field of dry grass, glowing faintly from the fires. The air was heavy with smoke, the horizon lost in haze. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out. When she collapsed, she lay still, her chest heaving, the stars flickering weakly above through the grey veil. A figure approached from the darkness, a man in tattered Soviet uniform, face blackened with soot. He said something she couldn't hear. She pointed to her ears, shaking her head. He knelt beside her, gestured toward the east, and mimed walking. She nodded. Together they moved through the night, using the burning camp behind them as a compass. Every few minutes they stopped to listen, not with ears, but with nerves, with breath, with the air itself. The faint rhythm of distant artillery still echoed from somewhere beyond the hills. That was where they would go. By dawn, they reached a ravine filled with fog. The man handed her a piece of bread, his eyes kind but tired. He tapped his chest, mouthed a word she read as partisan. Then he pointed toward the forest ahead. She understood. Resistance fighters. They moved under the trees, the branches whispering overhead in a language she could no longer hear but somehow felt. When they reached a clearing, he whistled softly, a signal to someone unseen. Shadows emerged from the undergrowth. 3 men and a woman, all armed, their faces thin and hollow but alive. One of them, an older man with a rifle slung over his shoulder, studied her for a long moment. Then he raised his hand in greeting and signed something, simple gestures, clear even without words. "You're safe." For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. She touched her chest, where the folded letter still rested, and nodded. Safe for now. That night, they gave her a new coat, a cup of hot water, and a blanket. She sat near the fire, watching its light dance over their faces. Someone was speaking softly, but she no longer tried to understand. The rhythm of their lips, the rise and fall of breath, it was enough. She closed her eyes and listened with her whole body. The fire cracked. The wind moved through the trees. And somewhere far away, she imagined the sea again, its rhythm, its pulse. The same silent heartbeat she had carried through every battle, every loss, every escape. She wasn't hearing it anymore. She was being it. Spring of 1944. 2 years had passed since the fall of Sevastopol. The war had swept across the continent like a tide, and now that tide was turning back. From the forests of Crimea, Soviet partisans moved like shadows through the hills, guiding the Red Army toward the city that had once been called impregnable. Yevdokiya marched with them. Her hair had grown longer, streaked with grey from exhaustion and smoke. She wore a partisan's coat several sizes too big, and around her neck hung a piece of copper wire, a fragment from the first radio she had ever repaired. It had become her talisman, the last remnant of her former life. They moved mostly at night, avoiding the open roads. She could not hear the distant rumble of artillery, but she could feel its soft vibrations through the earth, the pulse of a war returning home. Every tremor reminded her of that summer long ago, the bunker, the static, the city burning above her head. When they reached the outskirts of Sevastopol, the air smelled of salt again. The Black Sea stretched before them, grey and endless, the same as it had been the day she left. But now the smoke on the horizon was German, not Soviet. This time, they were the ones advancing. Her unit linked up with a Soviet reconnaissance detachment. Among the officers was a radio operator, a young woman no older than Yevdokiya had been when the siege began. She smiled shyly when introduced, unaware that she was standing before the woman who had once been the last signal of the fortress. That night, as the artillery began its bombardment, Yevdokiya watched from the hills. The flashes lit the clouds, each one a memory. For every shell that landed, she could name the street, the building, the place where a friend had died. But this time the fire was theirs. When the Red Army entered the city, the streets were unrecognizable, ruins where schools had been, craters where churches once stood. The sea wall still bore black scars, but the water beyond it shimmered faintly in the morning light. She walked among the wreckage in silence, her boots crunching over glass. Every few steps she stopped, touching the walls as if to reassure herself that the stones were real. At the edge of the harbor stood a broken antenna tower, its frame twisted but still upright. She approached it slowly, brushing dust from its base. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out the copper wire she had carried for years. With trembling fingers, she tied it to the rusted metal. The gesture was small, almost meaningless, but it made her smile. Nearby, engineers were setting up new transmitters, stringing lines, rebuilding the network that had once made the fortress speak. One of them called to her, gesturing for help. She joined them, her hands steady, her movements sure. For the first time in 2 years, she touched a radio again. The knobs, the wires, the hum of electricity through metal, it was all familiar, like the pulse of an old friend. When the power came on, the operator looked at her and said something. She couldn't hear it, but she understood from his lips, ready to send. She nodded. He pressed the key, transmitting the message across the reclaimed city. The words went out in steady Morse. Sevastopol secured. We are home. The operator smiled. She placed her hand on the desk, feeling the vibration of each pulse travel through the metal into her bones. She mouthed the words in silence, but her eyes were wet. For 2 years, she had lived without hearing a single sound. Yet now she could feel the city's voice returning through her fingertips. Every vibration was a heartbeat, every signal a memory. Outside, the harbor gleamed in the late afternoon light. Men raised a new flag over the fortress. The breeze caught it, unfolding the red cloth against the pale sky. Yevdokiya stood beside the antenna, her hand resting on the wire, and whispered the same words she had written in her letter so long ago. The city still lives. The war ended, but the silence stayed. Years passed like the slow turning of pages in a book she no longer expected to finish. The sound of gunfire faded from memory, replaced by the rhythm of footsteps in hallways, chalk on a blackboard, and the beating of her own heart. Yevdokiya became a teacher in a small town near the Dniester River. Her hearing never returned, though the doctors had tried treatments, injections, even operations, but she had already learned to live without it. She could read lips with precision, sense vibration through the floor, and predict a storm by the tremor of windows before anyone else noticed. Her classroom was bright and sparse. Maps hung on the walls: Europe, the Black Sea, the outlines of Crimea. A battered radio sat on a shelf above the teacher's desk. It no longer worked, but she kept it as others might keep a photograph, a relic of another life. The children who came to her school knew little of war. They were born after the fire, in a time of rebuilding. They laughed loudly, sang songs, and shouted answers she could not hear. But she could feel their voices through the wooden floor, the vibrations like ripples on water. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined it as a kind of music. She taught them to read, to write, to understand the stories that had survived. And sometimes she taught them something else: how to speak with their hands, how to count in rhythm, how to send a message without words. She called it the language of light and motion. The children loved it. They would tap messages on their desks, giggling as she tapped back with her pen, each knock a secret shared. One day, a curious student pointed to the old radio on the shelf. "Does it still work?" he asked. She smiled and shook her head. "No," she mouthed, then wrote on the board, "It doesn't need to." After class, when the room was empty, she would sometimes wind the old dial just to feel the soft click beneath her fingers. In her mind, the static returned not noise but memory, the faint hum of a world connected by invisible lines. At home, she lived simply a small apartment overlooking the river. On her balcony, she kept a box filled with papers, her wartime notebooks, her letters, her medals wrapped in cloth. She rarely opened it, though sometimes on winter nights she would sit beside it, running her hands across the faded covers. Each mark, each crease, each scar in the paper told a story no one else could read. One evening, a storm rolled in from the sea. Thunder flashed across the horizon, lighting up the sky in pale silver. The wind rattled the windows. She felt it through the floor, through the walls, through her bones. It reminded her of the night she lost her hearing, the sound she could no longer hear but would always remember. She wrote in her diary that night, "Hearing is not the only way to listen. Silence also speaks if you know how to read it." When the storm passed, the city glistened with rain. She stepped onto the balcony, the air cool and clean. Far away, lightning flickered above the sea, the same sea that once swallowed the city she defended. For a long time she stood there, eyes closed, her hands resting on the railing, feeling the echo of thunder through the metal. It was not sound, it was memory, and that was enough. Autumn of 1982. A television crew arrived at a modest apartment building in Odessa. They were producing a documentary about the veterans of the Black Sea Fleet, those who had fought, survived, and been forgotten. The woman they came to see was 70 years old. Her name was Yevdokiya Zavaliy. The cameraman expected a soldier's bearing someone stern, loud, perhaps still wrapped in the pride of uniform. Instead, he found a small woman with silver hair tied neatly at the back of her head, her hands steady as she poured tea. On the table beside her sat a cracked pair of headphones, a rusted flare casing, and a small notebook tied with a red ribbon. Her medals were nowhere in sight. They set up their equipment, adjusted the light, and began to ask questions. She could not hear them clearly, so the producer wrote them down on paper. She read each one slowly, smiled, and answered in a calm, even voice. "What do you remember most about the war?" one question read. She thought for a long time before replying. "I remember the light," she said. "Not the explosions, the light they made. It would flash, and for a second you could see everything clearly. The men beside you, the smoke, the sea. Then darkness again. That light was like truth, brief, painful, but real." Another question. "Were you afraid?" She laughed softly. "Always. But fear is just another signal. You can follow it, or you can let it control you. I followed mine." The cameraman zoomed in as she touched the old headphones on the table. "They no longer work," she said, "but I keep them to remember what listening felt like." On the wall behind her hung a faded photograph. A group of young soldiers on the cliffs above Sevastopol. One of them, a short figure in a helmet too large for her head, was Yevdokiya. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes clear and fierce. The caption at the bottom read, "Marine Corps 1942. The interviewer hesitated before the final question. "What do you think of when you hear the word silence?" She smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "Silence," she said, "is not emptiness. It's the space where memories live." She gestured toward the window, where the evening light slanted across the floor. "Sometimes at sunset, I can still feel the sea. Not the sound of it, but the weight. It's as if the city is breathing again, under all that water and time." The camera kept rolling as she stood and walked to the balcony. Outside, the horizon glowed orange, the same color as the fires of that summer long ago. She placed her hand on the railing and tapped her fingers once, twice, 3 times. Short, 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 then paused and smiled. "SOS, she said softly. "Some habits never leave." The screen faded to black. Her voice lingered in the narration, calm and steady, as if transmitted across time. "We were not heroes. We were signals. Each of us carried a message through the noise, hoping someone would receive it. The war took my hearing, but it gave me another kind of listening. Every heartbeat is a transmission. Every silence is a reply." And in the final image, the camera lingered on the notebook bound with red ribbon. Its last page read, in small, careful handwriting, "Battery 54. Signal received."